Now let me close and say, if you have questions about what is being discussed, please use the chat function. Also, this session will be recorded and be placed on Antioch's Climate Center's website. So now, I'm privileged to relinquish the stage to Abby and Running Grass.
Thank you so much, Michael, for those introductions and Running Grass. It's so nice to be here in this space with you and everyone who's joining us today for this, what is going to be really a conversation that takes as sort of its dominant theme, this focus that we have, this call to action that we have to really lean in immediately and persistently and with grace to tackle climate resilience, adaptation, and mitigation challenges through the lens of justice and equity. And I just want to welcome everybody who's been part of this 4-week ongoing community of practice, the Local Solutions Community of Practice. I invite you to think about, as Running Grass and I are having this conversation today, to just be thinking about what resonates for you in terms of our experience in this space now with the really rich conversations that you've been having over the last 4 weeks. And for those of you who are taking time to join us today as this one-off conversation event, thank you so much for making that time and for being here. We're going to be inviting people at the very end to share resources with everyone in the group. So if you want to be thinking about what kind of resources you'd like to share, please do that. No obligation, but we'd like to really capture the wisdom of the hive here. So we wanted to, Running Grass and I, start out with some introductions of ourselves to understand how we came into this work and to share a little bit of that with you. And so Running Grass, I really just want to tell you how much I appreciate and respect the fact that you have been at the leading edge of defining environmental justice, advocating for environmental justice, being part of that original group back in 1991 that put forward the principles of environmental justice that led to the creation of the unit within EPA that you have been working with for decades. I would love to hear your pathway into doing this work. How did you end up in Washington as part of that original summit? And what has really brought you to this place today of this strong focus on equity, justice, and the work that you're doing now?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much for your introduction, your presence here, Abby, and also Michael and the whole Antioch crew that's working in the background to make sure that all of our technical stuff works out okay. It takes an enormous amount of work. Appreciate all of you. My name is Running Grass, and I'm coming to you today from Sausalito, California, the historical traditional land of the southern band of the Miwok tribe here in the Bay Area. Again, I identify as African American, and my pronouns are he and him. And I think that's pretty much the main background there. But in terms of what you asked, Abby, you know, I actually can take very little credit for anything with environmental justice in actuality, though I've worked in it for a number of years. And I was a part of the 300 delegates, but even though that event was sort of at a moment of historical significance, it actually, the work on environmental justice, as you know, had been happening for many, many, many years in many, many, many communities internationally. Through the leadership of a number of people, that event occurred, and it really was sort of a launching point in the sense of the movement was able to identify what it was, together as an environmental justice movement. And the principles of environmental justice that you indicated were really our statement about what we stood for and what our principles were, what our first principles were of organization. And I always like to start out with, when I'm talking about environmental justice, with referring people to the principles of environmental justice, because they may not be really well known at all. There's so much going on, really, and so much about environmental justice and climate justice and all the rest. But how I got here, very briefly, is I'd always been interested. I mean, I grew up in the civil rights era, so I was always interested in civil rights. But my first interest at the time, I would define, like when I met Michael many decades ago, was I was in very mainstream environmental in a lot of ways. But in working with the anti-apartheid movement in the 1980s, and particularly around the sale in the West, in the United States, of the Krugerrand, which was South African gold, which I know that you're very aware of that situation and the plight of the miners, and how that sale of that gold was supporting the apartheid government along with the Reagan administration at the time. I began to understand the connection between social justice issues, between apartheid, civil rights on the one hand, and environment on the other hand, and how the two were really the same coin, two sides of the same coin, so to speak. And so from that point on, I really began to look for the places where issues of human rights and civil rights connected to fundamental issues of environmental concern. So that really is the evolution of that. And as an environmental educator, I was really well placed due to my work with Three Circles and in the Bay Area in the late 1980s and early 1990s, to sort of be inducted into the environmental justice universe at the time. And so that's basically where that is. And finally, one more piece, because it's come up. In 1997, I did make a fated move from my grassroots work in education to the EPA. I was not the only person from the movement that actually did a bit of time, and I'm still doing some time, in the Environmental Protection Agency. I didn't expect to stay as long as I did, but I did have a research question when I went into the EPA, and that was, how did this agency get into such trouble with communities? I really wanted to know about that. And I think it took me 22 years because I'm sort of a slow learner. But I think I did figure it out for myself, and now I'm out. And so
now you can talk about it.
I can renew my grassroots related work. So I appreciate that. And of course, how about you? I know our histories have run parallel in so many
ways. It was so exciting and fun to learn about sort of these parallel universes that we've been operating in. And I've thought a lot about it, because one of the themes that you and I wanted to share with this group today as part of this conversation is this notion of community memory, of community history, of knowing whenever you're entering into work with a new community, how important it is to know the history of that place, to know the history of that people, to really be able to understand the kind of cross-generational, almost cellular memory that people have. And so I was thinking a lot about myself in the same way. And I realized that when your heritage, as mine is part Quaker, part Jew, part Huguenot, and when you're female, you know something about forms of repression. And it turns out that you might also end up with a very steely spine when it comes to confronting injustice. And for me, that's often shown up as what the organizational scholar Deborah Meyerson calls being a tempered radical. Mm-hmm. So it's a complicated history and set of relationships. But the truth is, I was raised in a little progressive pocket of Northern Virginia outside of the District of Columbia, in a place that was intentionally socioeconomically and racially integrated by parents who were in an interfaith, interethnic union. And I had the very extreme privilege, really, of working for the first 10 years of my career in the international human rights field. It was that work in the 1990s that first connected me with BIPOC communities who were directly affected by major environmental justice impacts of the oil and gas and hard rock mining industries, logging industries, palm oil plantation, you name it, factory, fishing. And it was through that work that I really heard and began to understand for the very first time the terms climate change and biodiversity conservation. And it was there that I started on this decades-long journey that's brought me here into this space with you today. So it's been a journey, and it will be a journey. And that was another thing, really, when you and I were preparing for this conversation, that we talked about wanting to share with everyone, that there's a context for the conversation that we're having today. We're recognizing that we're at this time of incredible turning points. I really loved that phrase that you brought into our conversation, turning points across all kinds of dimensions: racial justice, climate crisis, income inequality, biodiversity conservation, and defending a democracy that has been shown to be a little more fragile and yet thankfully resilient in the face of a lot of challenge over the last number of years. And that's without even having mentioned the pandemic. So we're at all of these, this confluence of turning points. And that means that we also have these wonderful opportunities, right, to open up processes of transformation, structural transformation, value transformation. And so today, you brought into our conversation this notion of bringing our civic culture work to the fore, and knowing that this is the work that we're going to be doing alongside maybe the more technocratic aspects of our climate work. This is the work that we're going to be doing, all of us, for the next 20 to 30 years and beyond. And so we wanted to invite everyone, didn't we, to explore with us and to co-create with us a vision of transformation of these existing relationships and systems. And so I wanted to sort of invite you to talk about that context for this conversation today, that soft side that we're talking about of the work. How are you thinking? How are you thinking about that?
Yeah, in terms of the also the theme of today, as you mentioned, this notion of work within the work. That our work, we're so focused on the results that we have to get, and we're so focused on we're driven by time pressures, right? That we've internalized, and there's a press forward on that, and our work is can tend to be very walkish and very sort of detail oriented in those sort of practical kind of ways. And when I was thinking about this, and what would be maybe valuable to us, is really to shift from the foreground of where we usually are about our work, and really sort of look behind what's in the background, really, and bring the background forward. And that forward, that movement forward allows us to focus for a moment on this work that we do really concurrently and within our primary focus. And that work is really, what you might call the soft work of community and communication, sensitive communication, and so on and so forth. But actually, what we're doing, I think, fundamentally is involved in really creating the world that we want to live in, and it has to be forged with and aligned with the values of diversity and inclusion and equity. So I wanted to bring that forward, and even as we're doing our time pressure, detail-oriented technical work and talking policy and doing policy, we have to recognize that we're strengthening democracy and civic culture.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of the context, the three elements that I would like to bring out in this, and one is, of course, the idea of racial reckoning. And we're hearing a lot about racial reckoning these days, that the country is at that point. And what does that really mean, racial reckoning? And I think for myself, it means that the weight of our history on race as a country is really pressing on our present moment, including our work, and foreshadowing our and perhaps either limiting or fulfilling the potential of our future possibilities. So our work in environmentally related fields, climate justice, adaptation, mitigation, and so on, doesn't really escape the history of the country on race. We have very problematical origins of environmental work that you, and I'm sure that our audience knows about, because, you know,
Yeah.
20 years ago or 30 years ago, it was environmentalists and environmental EPA were the shining knights on, you know, white horses coming in for the rescue. But now we have been sensitized to the fact that, you know, there are very problematic origins to this thing called environmentalism, and it has not escaped the racial reckoning that we're in at the moment. So today we're looking at our—
And that's one of the resources that we wanted to share with everyone. Yeah, was
Yes.
some of the talks about the origins of the environmental movement
Yeah.
in the United States.
Yeah. Well, Robert,
Yeah.
I think it was Robert Gottlieb who wrote, was it early forging the spring or something of that nature back in the 1980s. He really went into sort of like a revisionist history of the environmental movement. And he talked a
Yeah.
lot about public health and how environmental justice was actually going back to the very origins of the environmental movement.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was really an important piece of documentation for me. But I'm hoping that in the context of climate change and justice, we can reckon with the past and accomplish the things we have to accomplish, a just transition, you know, and create a future that values diversity in all of its forms, and moves from equity to from equality to equity, and from inclusion to actual belonging. So there's a transition even in our notions of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yes. Yeah, that shift in language is really powerful. And that was a theme that we wanted to bring to this group today. And just thinking about, you know, books, I noticed my colleague, Dr. Alicia Maltz, has posted Robert Gottlieb's book title there in the chat. Thank you so much, Alicia. Another book that you and I talked about a little bit was Mark Dowie's book from the mid-1990s, Losing Ground, the history of the US environmental movement. And one of the really exciting things that I see happening right now is that, you know, 25 years ago when he was searching and writing that book, he was wishing for, he was calling for, he was visioning and sort of calling forth this idea that in order for environmentalism to be really successful in the United States, it had to stop being so polite. And it needed to become a real social movement in the way that the civil rights movement has been, in the way that other kinds of change movements have been successful in bringing about real social change in our country. And that book was very honest about the anti-Semitic, the racist origins of the movement, you know, the eugenics positions of some of the founders of the movement. And we all need to move past that and really move towards what he called the fourth wave of environmentalism, which is BIPOC led, which is, you know, planting social justice firmly at the core of the environmental work at the same time, so that we are really approaching this in an intersectional way, that we're not sort of siloing it out and thinking about, you know, doing environmental work versus doing social justice work versus doing climate work versus doing any other kind of work, but understanding that we need to knit and weave all those things together. So,
yeah, that early book that I was referring to by Gottlieb was Forcing the Spring, and he talked about public health as being really the first environmental movement, you know, and he traced how what we know today as the conservation movement really was split off from its origin. And, you know, scholars of color, of course, Bob Bullard and Dorceta Taylor have done incredible critiques of modern environmentalism. And though, you know, white scholars can sort of call for these things, you know, early on, it's really, I think, scholars of color and activists of color, people at the community level who are really defining what, some have called a fourth wave or an additional wave.
Yeah.
Carl Anthony, who founded the Urban Habitat Program, would always tell me, it's like, we're not on the margins. We people of color doing environmental work, we're not the ones on the margins. We have always actually been doing this work.
Yes.
This work is really the center of our lives, and it's this other thing, that calls itself environmentalism. That's really very marginal to, the work that we really have forged and been doing all along. So, I mean, who gets to define sort of history and to tell us, project what it should be or what it could be to be real? I think that there are forms of environmentalism that we can't even foresee, right now, forms of environmental activism that we can't even see. It's incredible what young people are doing, in particular at the community
It
level.
is.
It's just really remarkable. And I find myself really unable to really say what is a real environmentalist anymore. And, and if it even really matters to call someone an environmentalist, it just, the work of forging new possibilities is remarkable work, and young people are doing it.
Yeah, for sure it is. And that reminds me of another aspect that you and I have been talking about in preparing for today, which is this notion that this is about all of us, right? That we all have places where we can engage in this work. And that, there's this incredible youth movement that's emerging.
Mhm.
There is grassroots organizing in communities of color. There is leadership across the spectrum in terms of leadership in place. And just thinking about the fact that for success, it's going to be our collective success. It's going to be all of us engaging in this work. And I think part of what gets in the way for people sometimes is feeling that they don't want to make mistakes. They're afraid they'll say the wrong thing, do the wrong thing. When you're trying to collaborate across difference, you don't always know how to do it well. When we think about nurturing relationships of solidarity or responsive allyship, what would you like to share with this audience about, those who might be saying, yeah, I'd like to, but I'm a little nervous?
Well, the first thing that comes up is, for me, is the words of Martin Luther King, who said that everybody can serve. That there's something for all of us to do. But we have to do it, not only with the intention of doing well, doing good, but we have to do it with a sense of experimentation, because, as you mentioned at the beginning about a turning point, and how we're really at a moment where, in the present context of some real possibilities, of moving from resolving historical, moving through our difficult present moment and into a future that we are defining. We have to. It's an experiment, and we will make mistakes. We do make mistakes, every day, and collaborating across difference, I think, is, we still live very much in a segregated society, as you know, and we don't know each other in a lot of ways, and what we do know of each other is so infused and informed by the traumas of the past, which we, of course, our present experiences, and so we have to. It sounds trite, but we have to get to know each other. We have to build a different kinds of relationships with one another, so that we can move through and move past, our past traumas. This is difficult because it seems like nature is not really on our side now that we know that it must be ultimately, but that we can actually transmit our traumas, across generations. That the effort it's going to take to break the cycle of suffering is just it's a profound effort. And so how do we do that? And it is really the lifetime work of all of us, as you said, the next 20 to 30 years around climate change. But maybe it's the infinite, never-ending work of being human, of moving through the traumas that we inflict upon one another through the various oppressions. But I think one skill that's necessary is that we for our work and the success of our work is that we absolutely must take race on and the other oppressions. So I want to be, I love the phrase about being race forward, but we're not race exclusive, because we understand that oppressions work, and there are many different articulations and manifestations of oppressions, and ways that it takes form, and ways that it presses people, and ways that it's structured into our society and our social processes. But race is really clearly a central entryway into the whole array of oppressions that they are, because they all work fundamentally in similar ways of othering and discrimination, etc. So
Yeah, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
Well, so a word that you used really jumped out at me, which is experiment. And, America is an experiment. It's a big centuries-long experiment, and it's messy, and it's inspiring, and it's challenging, and it's heartbreaking. And I always think about the idea that it's not perfect. Nothing that's human is perfect. But the idea of America is working towards a more perfect union, right? And so, as you say, we're doing this work for the long haul. It's not something easy. It's not something that we do overnight. And I often think about, the feeling that I've had in my career of the times that I have been privileged to be able to really go deeply into this work are the times that I have felt that I've reconnected with my own humanity.
Yeah.
In a way that doesn't happen for me in my everyday life. It's a gift to be able to go that deeply, and it really is like regaining a part of yourself, your most human self, which is very powerful. We talked too about the language that we use and notions of charity versus notions of belonging, notions of empowerment, notions of inclusion. I really try to avoid the word charity because it has a lot of power dynamics baked into it.
Right.
And I love what you just were sharing about, whose perspective is the perspective we understand, what's the dominant narrative, right? And understanding that for communities that have experienced all forms of oppression, many different forms of oppression, it's not like we're suddenly in crisis. Like there's been an ongoing challenge and crisis for centuries, for 400 years in some cases, for 500 years in other cases. And, welcome to the challenge. Welcome to the center of what it means to engage in the work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't want to lose any of that. That's very rich. I wanted to go back to one thing that you ended with, and that had to do with coming back to your own humanity and just rediscovering your own humanity. And I think that renewal is the word that came up for me, of the refreshment that's available to us. As we look down into that long well of suffering, somewhere beneath that, there is a well of just of common humanity and common purpose, in common purpose in all its diversity, but to really move into create futures that really work for people, and that are truly equitable and are beyond just this level that we're at now of inclusion, but actually belonging. And I thank the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley for and the work of John C. Powell in cluing me into this idea of belonging versus inclusion. But the thing about communities and the traumas and the fact that this is not new for many of our communities. I mean, that resilience is also a part of, that's how we have survived, and it's connected to what we have come to know, the knowledge that we have constructed, in living in situations that are oppressive, and that knowledge, those assets are really that's our value, as well as our values. So we talk and going into communities and helping with mitigation and relocating communities. And I heard a lot about this in the last few weeks, that somehow we've got to find the leaders and find out what are the community assets, and work with the community assets to get across what we want to get across to people in the community, to serve them, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the language was interesting to hear. But that it's a very deep thing to really get in touch with the community's memory, and to really touch from a distance the various forms of knowledges that that are central at the heart of their resilience and at the heart of their historical experience. I like to say that we need to be social historians. That's a little studious and academic sounding in a way, but we have to be practical and applied histories of the people that we live with, that we share the planet with. So in multicultural education, which is one of the fields that I have had to teach myself as an environmental educator primarily, it's really clear that people of color, young people of color, the version of history that we get is not history that is constructed by our peoples. We're getting the histories of white people, of white Americans, of the white world, so we need to. We are, in multicultural education, surfacing these other histories, surfacing these other knowledges, finding and the values and the value of other cultures, of our own experiences. And we, our advice to the white world is to sort of read our histories, see how it feels to have narratives that are not your own, that are leading the way, that your narratives are dependent, upon the narratives, the slave narratives. You know what I mean? It's that kind of thing. So,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Well,
Yeah. Well, I'm also remembering that as we were talking in advance about this conversation, you reminded us of this beautiful quote that's been attributed to the Aboriginal rights movement, and that the Indigenous Australian Lilla Watson shared in Nairobi at the UN Women's Conference there, which is, if you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And it's such a powerful reminder of how to approach this work, how to be humble in the work, how to work alongside in the work. And I just want to say, as someone who identifies as white, who clearly shows up as white, it doesn't matter how woke I think I am, I'm still making mistakes all the time, because it's like a fish swimming in water, right? It's like the water we swim in is the water of white supremacy most of the time, white supremacy culture. And so how do we learn together how to dismantle that? It was some of my West Coast Antioch colleagues who gave me that idea of learning together, right? Instead of sort of being embarrassed, being ashamed for making mistakes, just remembering that we're all learning together how to do this. And we did have some resources that we'll share with this group today. One is the Jimenez Principles that comes from work between European heritage people, people of color, indigenous people, having figured out some basic principles for how to work together in really concrete ways. And another resource that we wanted to share with this group was from Kenneth Jones and Tema Oken from their 2001 work on characteristics of white supremacy culture. And, you know, the thing that I really appreciate about that very short, very clear, very pithy presentation of white supremacy culture as it typically shows up is that they're not just identifying it in very easy to understand ways to help us recognize it when we see it.
Right.
They're giving us antidotes. They're giving us antidotes for how to dismantle that culture. So I know that we'll be circling back to share those resources with people. And yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
So, you know, one actually is, I don't know how we're doing with time, but I just wanted to mention.
We're great. We've got 3 more minutes before we're going to throw it wide open to this audience, but no, go ahead.
Well, you know, the first thing was, you know, what you were, God, I've lost it here now. What I wanted to ask you, it's a bit putting you on the spot and asking you to speak for so many others perhaps, but, you know, where you were saying that, you know, recognizing, you know, that you mentioned the quote about how you come to others. If you're coming to others to help them, that you're wasting your time. And so I'm wondering, you know, do you feel that white environmentalists, mainstream environmentalists, and all of us who are doing our work around climate justice and climate change and alleviating the suffering of climate change, do you see where your liberation is bound up with the liberation of others?
Mhm.
What is that? I mean, is that something that white environmental organizations and white foundation managers and you know, et cetera, do you think, how deep is that awareness that your survival and even your liberation is bound up with the liberation of those, the most vulnerable, as Michael put it, and the most oppressed? Is that deep?
Yeah, that's such a powerful question. And I think you could actually do a whole research study, right? You could have a whole, you know, decades long research project that explores those questions. And that would be an incredible contribution. I can't speak at that scale. I certainly can't speak for all of those sectors or all of those perspectives. What I can say is in my own work, you know, I did some research looking at fossil fuel divestment. And I was looking specifically at US foundations and the leaders of those philanthropic organizations and what in the world possessed them to make this sort of radically different decision about how they were going to steward the assets of those organizations. And it was a process of liberation for them. You know, the interviews, and these are people, C-suite people, these are chairs of boards, presidents, executive directors, you know, sometimes managing $1 billion in assets. And I was really very moved by them because there were tears shed in our interviews of really appreciating how serious this situation is, about how deeply it affects people. And it wasn't concern for themselves, right? It wasn't concern about their own personal well-being, maybe about their grandchildren's personal well-being, but it was really oftentimes a very deep understanding of how the changing climate, how all of these other stressors are affecting people right? People who are the most vulnerable, who have historically been marginalized. And in the sense of, I think I had shared with you that some of my participants used words like feeling liberated by making this decision to divest, saying goodbye fossil fuels. We've tried to work with management. We've tried to get these companies to make a change. Nothing has worked. And so we're picking up our marbles and we're moving to a whole new playing field, and we're investing out of fossil fuels and we're investing in renewables. And we're not only doing that, but we're also looking for projects that we can invest in that are really dealing with empowering communities that are on the margins. And the words that the outpouring of positive emotion that these leaders felt about doing that work, about making that decision, which nobody had forced them to do. Nobody was conducting sit-ins in their offices or writing them petitions or, publicly shaming them. This was very powerful, positively deviant leadership that they were bringing. And just the feelings of satisfaction, of liberation, of joy, of pride, really showed me that when people honestly take the time to really understand the dynamics, when they really understand what's going on, they find a part of their humanity there, right? They recapture some of that. I don't know if I've answered your question, but
Yeah, well, I just think it's
yeah.
an important question to ask. It reminds me of sort of Gandhian nonviolence, where that the oppressor has to recognize his or her their own oppression within the oppression of others. That they are also diminished. There's a diminishment of their humanity as well, and the courage of the oppressed and the resilience of the oppressed from a nonviolence perspective in sort of helping. I hate to use that word. Actually, it's not the word to use, but it's helping others recognize in themselves the impact of their oppressive actions towards others.
Yes.
There's no getting away from the diminishment when one others someone else or others nature through the processes that you described with fossil fuels. That's an othering of nature, or othering wolves. It's the same cycle of oppression applied to people or applied to nature. I think that's really an important thing. The mechanism of oppression is the same. But anyway.
Yeah.
I forgot my
for sure.
Anyway.
well, so this is a perfect moment now, I think, to go to some questions, because I know people have them, and we want to make space for questions. So I wanted to invite Michael Simpson to come back into this space with us, because I think Michael has been actively paying attention to the chat function and tracking all the questions that are coming in. And Michael, I wondered if you wanted to pose a couple of these questions to us.
Yeah, I would, before you go on to other things that you're going to get feedback on. But I thought one interesting question was, and I'm paraphrasing, how do you connect with diverse communities, especially from a position of privilege? Do communities that are unlike our own or my own even want to connect with me or us?
Yeah. RG, do you want to go first?
It's almost it's our responsibility to reach out across, and again, going back to the idea that we are still very much largely in social life a segregated society, and so those boundaries that have been erected, between ethnicities, races, genders, et cetera, we have to challenge them. And so will mistakes be made and faux pas be made, or even worse, real substantial, materially felt mistakes be made? Yes, and we have to move through them. But it is the idea of expanding civic society means that we have to go out to the edge all the time. We have to go right up to the borders, and we have to be border crossers. You know, we have to cross those borders and not bring our own or surpass our own inner borders that keep us sort of locked into our privilege. This goes back to the whole question about whether oppressors, those in the oppressed class, those who benefit from oppression, are really sensing their own the cost to them, to their humanity. So go out and discover your humanity, every day by going right up to those borders and transgress.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. Thank you. I'll build on that to say, because I've actually been in that position many times. And, one of the things that I had to do in my career was start by first unpacking everything that I was taught about how to do the work. I was taught to parachute into a situation, to collect facts, to interview informants, to write reports, to tell other people, tell other governments what they should do or not do. And I had to train myself. I had to educate myself about what it meant to be in right relationship in doing this work. And for me, that meant looking for colleagues, looking for my peers in other communities, looking very, very sharply at what I could really bring to the table as an asset that was going to help to amplify their voices, that was going to help to advance the cause, and what I couldn't do. And to think about how to strengthen those assets that I could bring to be a better ally, to be a better colleague working in solidarity. And, this is a common argument when it comes to human rights abuses, where people will say, well, why are you butting in? What business do you have to be here? It's what Dr. King shines a spotlight on in Letter from Birmingham Jail. I'm here because injustice is here. I'm here because I've been asked to be here. And in order to be asked, you also have to extend a hand and offer, right? And show up with humility, and show up not on a junket or a tour that almost masquerades as some weird vacation exercise, but what is it that you really are going to commit to over a period of time? And I've been in that situation with my colleagues in Papua over decades. I've been in that situation with communities, indigenous communities in the West, in this country over years. And I know how much it takes to sustain those kinds of relationships. It takes a lot, and you really need to make the commitment. It's not something you dip in and out of. And it doesn't also have to be as painstakingly hard as I've just made it out to be, right? I think about groups like Good Old Lower East Side in New York City, which is a really powerful, very strong community-based organization of people on the Lower East Side who we've worked with a little bit through the center, the Climate Center. And we just show up and give what we can give and do what we're asked to do, and be a good ally. So that's maybe a clumsy way of answering that question, but RG, do you want to say anything else before we go to the next question?
Just that it's risky and dangerous, but it's all in your head.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's a good way of thinking about it. Go ahead,
more
Michael.
practical, but maybe it's actually talking about the role of the municipal planners, because municipal planners' role is quite broad in the municipality of all the issues they deal with planning. but they also have to deal with the historic decisions that were not just, inequitable. And where should municipal planners start to try to, one, educate people about the history of past decisions, but two, how to start addressing the inequity, the historical inequity?
I love that somebody asked that question. Yeah.
Well, you know, I recently I've been reading a lot of about architecture and race, and Mabel Wilson. I know it's not exactly planning, but it's sort of like an aspect of, you know, what happens when plans happen. You know, things get built. You know, decisions about land are made, you know, the whole idea somehow that even the physical man-made, person-made landscape, urban landscape, for example, is actually is the materialization of values and materialization of systems, and in our so many ways, in our cases, they are materializations of racial supremacy, you know, of white values, so to speak. And so, you know, I think being able to show people that, you know, when you make, this is completely off the wall, but it's just my idea of what happens with planning, and, you know, that the land, when we make decisions, we actually are materializing, we are investing in certain values. I mean, helping people to understand that this is not the land is not a neutral place upon which humans sort of, you know, make themselves. When we do that, but the land itself is not a neutral canvas for us just to go painting stuff on. You know, that it actually makes, we're actually creating history, and we are materializing values and value systems. And so helping people, I think, to see those sort of things, interpret actions, and that planning engenders or makes available. That could be one way. And I think understanding yourself as an individual and your profession in terms of how its liberatory possibilities, and how you can personally understand how oppression works, and understand how your professions are built on systems of supremacy. I was talking the other day with a young woman from UC Berkeley in the MBA program, the business school, and she was talking about the difficulty that she and her colleagues are having in getting the business school to sort of get on board with this racial reckoning, right? And she talked about how modern accounting practices are actually based on the accounting practices that were invented to keep track of the productivity of slaves.
Yeah.
You know, so even I imagine for planning, as Mabel Wilson is talking about with architecture, as educators, multicultural educators are talking about with the educational system, you know, that the white supremacy value system is so ingrained in our professions and in us who are doing our professions, that we don't even see it. You know, it's the egregious examples of that we see. So I think just the self-education and self-work and the critique of one's own professional kind of environment is really, really important. It won't always make you, I can tell you, it won't always make you popular among your peers, because they will say, well, what does that have to do with us? You know, why are you being a critic of what we're doing? It's like, no, we're trying to understand. We're just bringing a critical lens to what we do, what we take on as our profession. And I'm coming to that critical lens through my own work of self-understanding of where I sit in this in a social system that is informed and imbued with oppression. You see what I mean? That would be my best idea.
Yeah. Yeah. And I want to circle back to something that you said just a bit ago, which is, you know, about it being all in your head. if you're really about building relationships, it's not in your head, is it? It's in your heart.
Mhm.
It's in your hands. It's in your actions. It's how you show up. It's what you do. And that matters a lot more. And people know that, people can sense that.
Mhm.
So, maybe I'm gonna, because I tend to be a person who thinks a lot about stuff. I'm gonna really fixate on that. And I'm gonna be thinking about it being in the head versus being in other places, and what it means to really show up. We have a colleague right now who is getting off the ground this incredible project called Co-Designing Conservation, that our Seattle campus, our New England campus, are collaborating on. And it's really about bridging divides between zoological institutions and the host communities in which those places are usually based, people who don't view the zoo as a place for them, and this idea of co-designing the work is very, very powerful. That's probably another resource we could share about, that approach to co-design, right? I am mindful of our time. And Michael, do we have time for another question before we invite some additional sharing from the audience?
Sure. So this is more directed at Running Grass. Could you express or address the experience as a person of color who is expected to be polite and understanding with your white counterparts with regards to environmental justice, when at the same time, people of color are equally hurt and rightfully angry and are not able to express their grief and anger? How have you wrestled with this?
Well, wrestle is the right word, and it's a daily, it's a daily, it's a daily struggle. Um, I don't know that there's a formula for it. I think it goes back actually something earlier that came up about just taking care of yourself is really an important thing to do, and having a way of grounding, um, grounding our deep sense of trauma. Grounding doesn't mean suppressing it, not suppressing our anger, not suppressing our trauma, but having a way of grounding it and the letting the emotion actually just letting the earth take care of it, you know. And so when I think of that kind of thing, I mean, my own personal practices are intense yoga, intense aikido, which is a nonviolent Japanese martial art, and my practice of daily sitting meditation, Buddhist meditation. So um, those are ways, actual practical ways, as Heavy was saying, it's not in your head. I mean, it's like it's in your body. The answers are so much in our bodies. We are, as people of color, especially African American men, and women, we're so susceptible, vulnerable to high blood pressure, and diabetes and all of these things. And I am, struggling with this all the time. So I think the wellness practices, the health practices, health of body and mind are really important ways of dealing with it. And I spent 22 years at EPA. I've been retired for just over a year, and and I've been so busy I haven't been able to sort of uh, process it kind of as like sit down and write about what happened at EPA, though I intend to. But I have nightmares about the things that I saw and the things the decisions that were made, and the devaluation, even in the federal workplace. It was just unbelievable. Some of the things that I saw and heard and witnessed and was a part of and was a target for, So, but my daily practices are really the thing that kept me going. And I think also on a practical level, choosing your battles and knowing who your allies are and being willing to try to make allies, to try to get allies, to win people over to our cause, through slow, steady attention and dialogue with them. But choose your battles carefully, know who your allies are, have a good network support of colleagues that are like-minded, and take care of yourself through health practices, meditation, Aikido, martial arts, if you need to pound on a bag, or whatever it is that you need to do to really sort of let that energy ground and deepen. Now, I always feel like my answers about everything are so insufficient, and I know that was insufficient, but it's all I have at the moment. Feel free to include me in your network. Please write me. Include me in your network.
Thank you, Abby. Why don't you move, I think you have some information you want to share or get?
Well, yeah, I think Patrick was going to post to the chat the resources that we had pulled together in advance. And we wanted to crowdsource some resources. I think people have been doing that as we've been having this conversation. I've been seeing out of the corner of my eye some people posting things that they wanted to share. But now we'd like to really sort of put a spotlight on that. And Patrick has just posted in the chat some of the resources that we thought you all might find interesting in thinking about these kinds of questions. We wanted to invite you to share in the chat as well resources that you think have been really helpful to you, you've found really helpful, that you would like to share. And what we'll be doing is collating all of the resources that you share and then sharing out that big list, that big resource doc with everybody. Probably, I guess, when the recording from this conversation goes out. And yeah, so this is an invitation to you all to share away in the chat.
Can I say something, please? I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sharon Cohen, hi. I just want to let you know that what you've talked about truly resonates with me. I'm 71, and 50 years ago, we're having our reunion at University of Wisconsin. 50 years ago, I was out in the street with the Black Panthers. So that's where I'm at. And yesterday, it was amazing when I was listening to people in Minneapolis. And I think we have a struggle on both sides. We have a struggle on the whites who don't want to hear, but we also have a struggle with people of color and other individuals who have been disenfranchised, who don't want to talk, or are given up hope. And that's really very disconcerting to me when I see that. I'm coming through this and this has been really amazing doing this from a climate change. I'm coming from a mental health disaster standpoint, and the same people who, after a disaster, whether it's the natural disaster like now we just had in Texas, or whether it's the shootings that we have, these are the people who are traumatized, re-traumatized, and re-traumatized over and over again because of the same purposes. And I'd like to know what we can do about the siloing. We all want to reach this end goal of people talking together. But even in mental health, we have the people who want to deal with opioids, and the people who want to deal with alcohol, the people who want to deal with bipolar. And we don't talk in groups anymore. We only talk in silos. And everything that we have covered here in climate change is so indicative of what's happening in mental health and disasters too. And I don't know how we get away from the fact that we're doing this.
Yeah, Sharon, thank you for that. You know, I'm reminded of a couple of things. One is that in the life of a social movement, there's always this point where success seems completely impossible. And all the research on social movements shows that that's the moment right before there's some breakthrough, some success breakthrough. And I think that that's what we're seeing. I mean, I think yesterday's court decision, as someone who's looked at the impunity of law enforcement with respect to human rights violations in a lot of different situations, that was a breakthrough. That was a breakthrough of accountability. That was a breakthrough of justice. And the tide really is turning. And sometimes it may be hard to see that. And people who have felt that oppression for so long may not even be cautiously optimistic. I can't speak to that, but from my vantage point, I just think there's enormous positive change that's possible and that is beginning to show itself. And that's going to continue to show itself. And it's not just going to magically happen. It's going to be because of the work of all of us to bring that into being. But I for sure see that transformative changes are beginning to unfold. RG, what do you want to say?
What Abby said.
Yeah. So don't give up hope. I mean, really, it's changing. I'm going to go back into my headspace because I'm sorry, that's where I spend a lot of time. But one of the models that I think is just a really brilliant model for understanding change in social systems, in human systems, in natural systems is this model called panarchy. And in panarchy, there are 4 phases. And there's a phase of stability in the system where it's business as usual. And what comes after that phase is a phase of collapse. It's where that status quo, that business as usual starts to disintegrate, starts to fall apart, starts to fray at the edges. And what I find most inspiring about that model, this is the work of Holling and Gunderson, is that it's not a linear process. It's not like you fall off the end of the cliff at that point. That bit of chaos, that bit of collapse is a precursor to reorganization, which is the next phase in this 4-phase process. And that's inspiring because it's in that process of reorganization that you can actually cement new systems. You can really begin to embed the changes that you've hoped for, that you've fought for, that you've struggled for, that you've had as a vision. You can make them real. And that's the opportunity that all of us have right now, is to take what has been maybe a long-held dream, maybe a long-held or evolving vision for change, and really find the places where we're going to put it into concrete practice. And then build it up, which is that last of the 4 phases. Build it, strengthen it, build it and strengthen it. Some nice things coming through on the chat here. So thank you to everybody who's posting. And I know that we have a little less than 20 more minutes. We've now got almost about 15 more minutes in our conversation today. RG, did you want to weigh in on anything that we've just been saying?
No, I was going back though to Rob Rosen, I think, had a question that he wanted us to get on unmute and say. I think it was.
Oh, great. Okay.
Was that correct?
Rob Rosine. Rob, are you still out there?
I am here. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah. Yeah, I was curious as to your thoughts. It seems that there's some real big potential opportunities, particularly with the infrastructure bill that exists, and some of the awareness, I would say, at least on my side, that really I feel I've recently become aware of with respect to underinvestment in water infrastructure, particularly you know, in the recent freeze that happened in Texas or in the South, there was been reading some great pieces about this, or terrible pieces about this, but very real eye-opening pieces about you know, communities in the US where there is basically no wastewater, very little drinking water. These are certainly issues of environmental justice, some of them rural, some of them not. You know, really due to chronic underinvestment, and I believe in the infrastructure bill, there's some funds that would be dedicated specifically to these areas that have been chronically underinvested, you know, where we're talking, you know, Montgomery, Alabama, for example, is saying that, you know, the underinvestment there totals over $1 billion. And you know, similar pieces could be said, say, for like Flint, Michigan, right? So Flint, you know, the issue with the water quality there was really not a surprise for anybody who knows water. We understood that would happen. It was just you know, the travesty of how it was managed. So just wondering what your thoughts are, if you see any opportunities for improvements in some of this underinvestment.
Well, yeah, when you were listing places where that underinvestment has been the case and the public health implications of that, I was thinking of Alaska and Alaskan Native villages. You know, I was able, when I was working with Region 10 EPA, I was able to visit some of them, and it's the thing. It's amazing to see this, the conditions that people are living under, and they want to change these things. And there are projects going on to ameliorate some of those conditions, but and in some cases it's not possible to build the kind of infrastructure, you know, with some of the remote villages. But there's a recent book by a woman, her last name I think is Coleman, and maybe you have read this. She's been on
Catherine Coleman Flowers. Yeah.
Yeah, I think someone's just posted this in the chat as well as a resource.
Yeah, that's great too.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just want to say, you know, infrastructure has been on the agenda now politically for quite a while. It's sort of that not very sexy thing that people didn't really want to pay any attention to, didn't want to talk about, but is critically important to all of us. And I really, you know, I don't want to sugarcoat it. I don't want to put rose-colored glasses on, but I really feel such a renewed sense of faith in the federal government to get things done with this new administration. I'm going to get political here, but I really see people at work who know how important it is to get this stuff done, who have the chops and the experience to know how to get it done, which is even more challenging than knowing what you want to do. It's like, do you know how to get it done? And I think we're, you know, it doesn't mean we don't all have to continue to be the activists that we need to be. And I really appreciate what Josh O'Neill put into the chat about that just a couple minutes ago. We do all need to be activists. And, you know, as is always true in a democratic system, you got to create the political space for leaders to do what they need to do.
Yeah.
You got to make them do it, and support them when they do it. Thank them when they do it. Spank them when they don't. You know, so yeah, it's a good point.
Thank you. And one other thing I guess would be to say, you know, the excitement potentially with Deb Haaland now, right? This is just amazing.
It's historic. It's amazing.
It's just unbelievable.
Who could imagine?
I was wondering does the Interior Department have any role in infrastructure and reservations?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
The question is, does the Interior Department have any role in in influencing the infrastructure within reservation? I mean, they're sovereign states, they're sovereign nations, and that's a level of detail I don't know. Does somebody else know? Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a great question. Okay, and thanks to everybody who's been sharing in the chat the resources that you've been putting in there. That's been great. I want to source, you know, this community of practice that the Antioch Center for Climate Preparedness and Community Resilience that has been running for the last 4 weeks. We've been doing this community of practice because of the pandemic. Normally, every 2 years, we'd have a convening in person. We'd all be getting together and having in-person sessions and conversations. Thank you, Ned, for what you're posting there in the chat. And this has been a pivot for us to take this all into an online space. But I was thinking back to the very first convening that Antioch did back in 2014, and we had a conversational keynote that was part of that convening. And one of our conversationalists was Bina Venkatraman, who's right now serving as the Boston Globe's editorial page editor, and who at the time was in the Obama administration as senior advisor on climate innovation. And I just have seen recently that Bina has teamed up with Dr. Ibram X. Kendi at Boston University to launch this anti-racist multimedia platform and to bring to the 21st century what was founded 200 years ago, a newspaper called The Emancipator, which at that time was focused on ending slavery. And Bina and Dr. Kendi have teamed up to create this new platform, to create spaces for conversations like the one that we've been having today that are about anti-racism. And how do we have a vision of what an anti-racist US society looks like, and how do we make it real? So that's just another resource. I think Patrick can put a link into the chat. Yep, there it is, about that initiative. But it's really nice 7 years on to see the leadership that Bina is still bringing, and to see the way that she's really teamed up to shine a spotlight on anti-racism. Yeah.
So Abby, I just want to jump in and go back to a question that sort of bounces off as may counteract it. It's like, you know, can we really regain a just path without a major societal catharsis and suffering?
Isn't that what we have now? I think we already.
Yep. Whose narrative is at the center there, Michael Simpson? That's the question. Go ahead, RG.
No, that was just it. I think we have it now, and we create the path as we walk it. You know, I think fearing the cataclysm, we're already in that, so we don't have to fear that anymore.
Yeah. So this is a nice moment to say, you know, our colleague Dr. Dawn Murray shared with us in the ES department at Antioch a Scientific American story that just came out in the last week or two, and it was raising a really, you know, maybe provocative question, which builds on this part of our conversation, which was, is the climate crisis just something that white people see as a crisis because it's now, you know, an extension of, an extension of that lack of sense of safety that people who have been in more privileged positions have been feeling for decades and decades and decades. And now, okay, that's being eroded because of climate change. But this circles back, RG, to something that you were talking about earlier in our conversation today, that, you know, this is not new for BIPOC communities. Do you want to comment on that?
I just have probably a long-winded story from my grandmother. But when I broke a window once, I was about 9 years old, and of course my first inclination was to run. and I ran home. But by that time, because the neighborhood, all the neighbors were my surrogate mothers and fathers and grandmas and grandpas, that, you know, the news had already reached home. So I was pretty worried, and my grandmother said, you know, so you look really worried. What's up? I said, well, I think I'm in trouble. And she said, oh, really? What about what? And I said, well, I broke a window. I broke Miss Jones's window by accident. And she said, oh, she said, you don't ever have to worry about being in trouble anymore. And I said, really? Why not? And she said, because you were born black. So you don't ever have to worry about being in trouble anymore. Now, what about that window? I think so, you know, our life of privilege really has protected us from trouble, you know, and feeling trouble, you know, feeling like we're in trouble. And story doesn't exactly that analogous, but, you know, so as that privilege sort of is still there, but, you know, the troubles loom so much larger, and it's connected to the privilege. Mm-hmm. Trouble's connected to the privilege. And so the privilege becomes problematic, you know, in good ways, and we should problematize it. We should show the connections, and that will hopefully cause a reassessment and a orientation and a reorganization. That's all.
Yeah. So that makes me think a lot again about Letter from Birmingham Jail. And there's a section in that letter. I mean, I think that's one of the most powerful pieces of writing about social justice, about advocacy, that I have ever read. I have students read that every year. But there's a section in the work where Dr. King talks about, you know, he's sort of being accused of being a troublemaker, right? Of bringing trouble. And he says, I'm not the troublemaker. The trouble is there. I'm just bringing it to the surface so it can heal. Yeah, he uses that analogy of, you know, of an infection, of a wound that's infected, and you have to open it up to air and light and look at it and make it visible in order for it to be able to heal. And so that's a lot of what we're going to be facing, right? Yeah. So Michael is letting us know that we've got about 2 more minutes for this conversation today. I wonder, Running Grass, if there's anything else that you would like to share before we begin to wrap up.
I would say just the sort of what I alluded to at the beginning about our work. And that really you know, we have our work, as Sharon Cohen had mentioned, you know, we want to get to the results. We want to do the results. We have to do that. We're driven by the emergency of the moment, but also to recognize really the deep work we're doing on society, and the deep work we must do on ourselves continuously to be able to do that work in society. You know, and the work that we would be doing on ourselves is really ultimately the work that all of us need to be doing socially in terms of our collectively. So I, you know, keep that in mind. And it's you know, if you feel in trouble, you don't have to worry about it because you're already in trouble. You know, so transgress those boundaries, and know that it's not all in your head, but it's also in your body. And your bodies, and you know, keep moving forward.
Gee, thank you so much. I have just so much appreciated this time that we've had with everybody today. And I think the one place that I want to wrap up with is coming back to that notion of silos that we talked about during this conversation, and how imperative it is that we overcome all of those silos, right? I mean, if there's one thing that we know works, it's having a big idea for what you want to do and then engaging in collective action. don't be a solo superhero, like get with others. That's part of what this community of practice has been all about. But, find your partners, find your people, find your allies, find your place, and know that collective action works. Trust it. It works every time. Okay. Well, everybody, thank you so much. This has just been a real pleasure. I think I saw a question about whether this was being recorded. Yes, it's been recorded and the recording will be shared. And we'll also share out the resources that all of you have shared.
Yeah, so the recording
Thank
will,
you so much.
yeah, the recording is going to go up on the center's website. And for the people in the facilitated community of practice, it will go on to the living agenda that you have access to. And just to let you know, we're going to follow up with a really quick questionnaire. So if it comes in to sort of evaluate this part of the facilitated community of practice, we'd like your feedback, though. I've been seeing all the great feedback we've been getting in the chat. So thank you all, and thank you, Abby, and thank you, Running Grass. This was amazing. So I appreciate the time and the dedication that you've spent in your lives doing the good work. So thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you. Okay, take care.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
So we'll catch up sometime, Abby.